hold space to honor those who came before us, meaning that we're not the first nor the last people to gather in community to discuss literature. None of us were born woke. All of us had someone that taught us to be here today. And this is a space and time to shout out the names of those people who are no longer physically with us, who have transcended into the ancestral realm, to invite them to join our conversation as a way to honor the work that they did and, be in conversation with them as we continue the work in their legacy. And so you can shout out the names by unmuting yourself, or you can type it in the chat box. And we would honor the names that get said aloud, the names that get written down, and of course, those that we don't know, and all the nameless that came before us as well. We'll honor and hold them in our hearts too. So we'll take some time for that as well.
Rosa Guy.
George Floyd.
Khalif Browder.
Maceo Cleaver.
Lillian Robinson.
Juan Flores. June Jordan. Breonna Taylor. Marsha P. Johnson. Sylvia Rivera. Okay, I'm going to read some of the names in the chat before we wrap this part of the grounding. Toni Morrison, Kalila Brand, Krista Franklin. Cool. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Come on, B, let's go.
So with that, we can get the conversation started. We are reading up to chapter 8. This is our third week reading All About Love, New Visions by Bell Hooks. The way that it works is that this is a cumulative conversation. The conversation starts with you all. So wherever you want to begin, whatever questions, critiques, if you were confused, this is the time to begin the conversation. So we can start wherever you guys would like. Feel free to comment or unmute yourself. One thing is that, as we speak and as we share with each other, let's try to be mindful and practice one mic. So if one person is speaking, we can wait our turn before we speak before. Also acknowledging that, this is a shared space. And so all of us sharing makes the conversation richer, and we also learn more like that. But if you don't want to share, just want to listen, that's also perfectly encouraged and welcome. So don't feel pressure at the same time. The goal is for you to enjoy yourself for the next hour. So we can kick it off.
I mean, I guess I'll kick off. Can we hear me all right? Yes, hi. Hi, everybody. I guess we'll start with in this first chapter we had to do today on values. I'm interested in what people think of the concept of the perfect love. If you could refer to page 93, where she talks about the concept of there being no fear in love, and that perfect love doesn't mean that it is empty of all flaws in the sense that, oh, it's the perfect, situation, or just the idea that it's constantly being refined. And it even goes back to what we've been saying since week one, the idea that in a culture of domination that cannot sync up with the concept of a perfect love if there's domination involved. Just wondering what people thought about that.
Right. Hooks has definitely contextualized love within the greater structures of, I would say, the United States. It doesn't seem like she's necessarily speaking to the diaspora in this book. But in terms of the United States, it seems like she's definitely couching it in relation to patriarchy, in relation to dominance, in relation to capitalism, greed, consumerism, almost as if love can't happen. But I think her comment around, working on it as a process, it has to happen if this is how love is being presented to us in her argument, is my opinion. It's like, of course, love is an ongoing thing because we live in a society that constantly forces us to unlearn and check ourselves in terms of how we're exercising love because of how it's presented to us through the mass media. That's my take on it. Anybody else has any other opinions or thoughts on that?
Yeah, just going off of the defining love, like being there's no fear in love, and on that same page 93 where she talks about love is a constant something that you have to refine, and like redefining perfect, or I would say she was just emphasizing the verb effect of perfect versus being perfect, and just refining love to be that manner. But then in chapter 8 too, like I kind of had a little issue, not an issue, but like I just wanted to get the group's feedback on like, how do you feel about that? What she says on perfecting love and allowing for mistakes to be made in love. And then as well as in chapter 8, she talks about forgiveness as in terms of releasing someone from their, what you say, anguish and guilt. Like, at what point can you be in a love ethic and that love ethic becomes too abusive to the point where, like there's a fine line between forgiveness and that love relationship becoming too abusive. So I was curious to get anyone else's feedback on that.
Blanche, what page were you on?
The thing about the perfecting is on page 93, and then in chapter 8, where she's talking about the forgiveness, is on page 139. The third line, she talks about forgiveness is an act of generosity. It requires that we place releasing someone else from the prison of their guilt or anguish over our feelings of outrage or anger. So it's like, I understand where she's coming from, but it's just like, I still think we have to be careful that we acknowledge our own feelings, especially in terms of we're going to continue with whatever person, whether it be an intimate relationship or a platonic one.
I mean, I don't know if she's saying that you have to stay in the relationship. I think she's more so saying that, I think she's challenging us to empathize with other folks. And I agree that that's challenging. depending on the situation. And she doesn't really talk about, I wish she would have talked about abusive situations and where that line is for sure.
Mhm.
Because when she talks about her friend, it does seem like, when she gives the example of her friend, it seems like she leaves that relationship.
No, but is she talking about forgiveness as in forgive and forget, or forgiveness to release yourself as well? You can forgive somebody and still not stay in the relationship. It's like, I can forgive that you've hurt me. I just can't be here anymore, but I forgive you. With her first line, when she says it's an act of generosity, I think it's as much an act of generosity for yourself to release yourself as it is for the other person.
Yeah, and I think in that chapter, she's also talking about loving in community, it's community loving communion. And I think the line in like the paragraph where she says realistically being part of a loving community on page 139, realistically being part of a loving community does not mean we will not face conflicts, betrayals, negative outcomes from positive actions, or bad things happening to good people. Love allows us to confront these negative realities in a manner that is life affirming and life enhancing. I thought that's interesting. And I think in the last chapter to think about, or was it this very one where she talks about like almost like cancel culture? This is before cancel culture actually like is a thing as like a word or a term, but she does also touch base upon that, about like the disposability in a consumerist society people and throwing them away. So this is something that often comes up, I guess, in as a community organizer. Oftentimes, community can be seen as a double-edged sword, where yes, it's a source of like inspiration, source of love, but also within communities there can be also lots of conflict. There can be toxic relationships in community. It's not always a romanticized sort of like positive thing. And I think that was her gesture of like naming that. And then on page 116, she offers something that says, well, if that person is not satisfying your needs, you should get rid of them. Relationships are treated like Dixie cups. So I think, what does that say to you guys in terms of like your experiences, I guess, with understanding, I guess, a boundary in this way where, she sees it as disposability. Other people will see it as like, well, I'm done and I don't need to talk to you anymore. You're out of my community. Or do you see it differently?
This is Rachel. I think it's interesting because I know probably the context that she was writing it in. We're a little bit different today. I think, and I think we've changed over time in some ways in terms of forgiveness, especially when we're talking about people of color, and constantly forgiving of folks that have oppressed us or people that have done harm to persons of color. And I think for a long time, I think culturally there has been this emphasis on forgiveness. And I think currently people are saying, I'm tired of that. There has to be some accountability. There has to be some sort of way to address this. And it just can't be like, I forgive you now and we can move from this. And so I think when we look at it in maybe the context that she was writing this in, there was a different mood around forgiveness. And how that was accepted at that time versus how we're talking about forgiveness now. And while I do think it still is applicable to today, I think that we're a little bit more critical of forgiveness today than we were back then. And back then, I mean, it was the 80s, right? It wasn't that long ago, but it's still, I think we're confronting some issues today where we're saying, I can forgive, but there has to be some accountability for the actions that have been taken because they keep happening over and over again. And no matter how much I forgive you, it doesn't appear to be changing what's happening, and what someone framed as the abuse that continues to happen in my community, if you want to frame it larger than just like a relationship with one other person. We can talk about police brutality or the way the justice system treats people of color. And so, you know, that type of like forgiveness is like looked upon more critically than I think it was prior. I mean, you know, when she was writing this novel. And I think I wonder if she had written it today, would she have dug into that a little bit more, given the current context of like what we've been talking about and how we've been dealing with forgiveness in current days.
I think I want to just add something regarding forgiveness. I think it's perhaps in the time that she wrote this, you know, it's a very simplistic kind of concept with a miraculous end result. But I think of forgiveness as like a 122-step program, which encompasses all of the emotions, rage, joy, anger, the whole range of emotions. It's really a series of steps that people arrive at. It's not a miraculous event, and that could be years in the making. And I don't think we allow people to think like that in this culture. But you know, especially for Black people, we don't get over nothing quick, right? So we need the 122 steps. I'm joking. I'm really joking. But you know, I see it more as a process, and I don't think it really works for people emotionally if they don't allow themselves to feel whatever that is, anger, rage, depression, whatever.
Mhm.
I won't believe that you've forgiven if I don't see the range, if I don't see a process, and a process that reestablishes broken boundaries, you know? I think we've been passing that same broken calabash and beat up shell from one generation to the next, and it's a useless damn thing, you know, unless we deepen it and broaden it and do something with it. All right, shut my mouth.
I feel like related to what.
No, thank you, Jacqueline. I think also as part of like, oh, go ahead.
Me? So I think related to what's kind of coming up, one of the things that like really stood out for me in this most recent section is like, I think she's trying to encourage us to just think really radically about what's possible. But in the attempt to do that, she's leaving out a lot of stuff. So like the chapter on values, I felt like that's a great, like this is all very great to think about. Like what would it be if we took a love ethic in every single aspect of our lives, into public policy, you know, into all aspects of society. But then on the other hand, and she, you know, brings up the example of like someone moving into a different community from her own and they manage to figure out new ways of being. But like, she never, for me, talks enough about conflict. So not even like abusive relationships, but just there's like natural, healthy conflict that arises both sort of on an individual level and like a society level. And so it's great to think like maybe there's a way, if we all were more peaceful and more loving, that we can come up with a different way to deal with all the stuff that gets in the way. But like she never goes into it. And for me, that's like one of the big problems that I had like within this section is that, you know, conflict can be good, conflict can be progressive, but there's got to be a way to talk about conflict in maybe a loving way. And it feels like that divide between when this book was written and where we are now is about a different way that our society has been thinking about conflict and saying there's certain things you just can't do anymore. And maybe that's not using a loving epic, but you know, I would love to see more of that. Like, how do we deal with, you know, basic things about human nature that come up all the time?
I also think that the word forgiveness is often used as, I forgive you and now we're okay. And, you know, just thinking of the incident that happened yesterday right here in Central Park, you know, she said, I forgive, I'm not racist or whatever. And it's just, I think somehow people have kind of lost it isn't about the race, it's about using that as an excuse. I didn't mean it. And, you know, sometimes I think people say, I forgive you when they really don't, or maybe they really shouldn't. So I think that, you know, it's just, what are you willing to overlook? And I think as Camilla was talking about, you know, values and, you know, where you are and what's important to you has to be something that you take to all of your relationships. And there's going to be conflict. We all can't ever agree on everything, but that, you know, you just have to be reasonable about what's important to me, and then how am I going to deal with the next person based on that.
Mhm.
I was thinking, I read this book a long time ago, and I do feel like a different way about reading it now than I did then, and how I felt like I agreed so much with Bell Hooks, you know, back then, and now I am kind of like, okay, she is making some there are some things that are left out. Like you know, I do agree with Camilla. Like some things are left out, or there's some places where I'm like, okay, wait, you just made a leap from here to there, you know, about, you know, patriarchy and love, and it does make sense, but you know, I don't know, I bought into it more a long time ago. But I was just thinking about a point she did make about you know, love, and she says on page 94, and you know, we see movies in which people are represented as being in love, who never talk with one another, who fall into bed without ever discussing their bodies, their sexual needs, their likes and dislikes. Indeed, the message received from the mass media is that knowledge makes love less compelling, that it is ignorance that gives love its erotic and transgressive edge. So I don't know, that part, I was just wondering what people thought about that, if people agree with that, or, you know, and how often do you sit and talk with people before, you know, before things, and you discuss, and how realistic is that? And so I don't know. That's just something I was thinking about.
Yeah, I got a word on that. I took notes on that mass media part you just cited, of how that really doesn't hold up. That point she made, if you're looking at it through today's lens of modern movies, because you could cite any number of movies in which love is shown to be in a healthy light. I can think of Moonlight. I think of If Beale Street Could Talk. If people are familiar with the movie Atlantics, like all of these portray love in a way that Bell Hooks, I would imagine, would sign off on and agree with. So her critique of that didn't seem to really stand the test of time as well. So I'm glad you pointed that out, because I was wanting to bring that up.
But on the other hand, any reality show, pick your favorite, right? It is that superficial level of love, and that's like so-called reality. So I feel like it's not valid in a certain way, but it got displaced. And even like, you know, I'm sure among this crowd, plenty of people like are either practicing radical honesty in their relationships, or they know have those friends who like have to hyper process every single thing, right? But that's still the exception. It's not really the norm, it feels like. But that's just me.
I was looking in, was it the chapter about greed, and how she was citing, it's on page 113, in the 7 laws of money. Michael Phillips calls attention to the fact that most of the prisoners he encountered incarcerated for stealing as they attempted to get rich quick were smart, industrious individuals who could have worked and attained material wealth. Working daily to earn their money would have taken time. And I love Bell Hooks. I do. Like, some of the stuff is just like on point. But to me, I'm just like, this Michael Phillips, for instance, and even herself, like, I was thinking when I was reading this, like, oh boy, has she not been co-signed by affluent women, mostly white, who backed her, she would not have obtained the wealth that she has today, you know, to have a city home and a country home. You know what I'm saying? And then to to cite this dude who's saying like, oh, had those guys who got those, you know, we're thinking black, or you know, minorities gotten those, had worked every single day, they would have gotten what they've earned, you know, by working, you know, pulling their bootstraps up. You know what I'm saying? We've heard this rhetoric before, and so and I think even if she had gone back and read her stuff back in the day, she probably would have been like, this doesn't really fly today, because that's very unfair. And for her to cite this guy, you know, who's going into prisons, making money off of these people's stories, you know what I'm saying? Like, something about that, it didn't sit well with me reading that. And then even with her talking about the drug dealers and what all they did, you know, to the community or what have you, I'm like, Belle, you know what I'm saying? You know that they didn't have a fair life. And I'm not saying it's okay. I'm not saying it's okay to kill. It's not okay to steal. It's not okay to sell drugs. But to act as if those people were on an equal playing level, she wouldn't even buy that today. She wouldn't. I'm just saying, she wouldn't.
Yeah, and I think also that's an assumption in terms of like, it's interesting that she talks about work as like something that is respectable, that if you work really hard, like how you were saying, yeah, at the same time, she's not necessarily valuing the worker. It's like you should just be working really hard, but there's no language around valuing the worker or having any sort of analysis around, you know, specifically in this conversation, she failed to say anything about capitalism. She failed to say anything about the prison industrial complex, which seems to me lazy in her analysis when she could bring this up earlier on in the text and has access to that language to frame it this way. Also on page 112, she says, our prisons are full of people whose crimes are motivated by greed, usually the lust for money. And I feel like there's a few things in this particular chapter that Rachel was saying, like she kind of makes a leap or is very pathologizing. And yeah, so they were on page 106. I felt like that was a lot, where she's like, nowadays we live in a world where poor teenagers are willing to maim and murder for a pair of tennis shoes or designer coat. I felt like she's dragging it there a little.
Yeah, yeah, sorry. So that rubbed me the wrong way. I don't know why. I was just like, but I liked you, Bell Hook. Like, I was just thinking, like, I read this. I was just like, oh, Bell Hook. And then I'm reading it again, and I was like, what? Yeah.
Yeah, I noticed at one point she mentions where we could love our way out of racism. I'm like, girl. But so yeah, like points in this chapter in particular, yeah, was pretty disappointing, because like you said, you can't just say people are full in prisons just to do blase when we know that, you know, people have gone to prisons for small amounts of weed, you know, like that's just not the case. And I feel like it's irresponsible, especially with the persona that she has, to make such statements without giving a full analysis.
If I may, I felt that this chapter was a kind of rubbish. I felt that if she's going to make such assumptions and such general claims, she better throw in some citations, some statistics, because to make such generalizations that a mother, a disenfranchised mother, a single mother with a child that wants to go push drugs to have material luxuries, what, the light, having food on your table, making sure your kids have lunch money, that's a luxury? I mean, people have to swallow their pride to make it out here, to be underprivileged. And for her to say they don't have love, to bring it back to love, that they don't have love, that is so disrespectful. That is so unclassed. Like, very, let's just say, for her to take that such approach, that there are people who kind of they choose to do that. But I'd rather, I mean, if I may, I'd rather like go push drugs if that's all I can do to make it during this pandemic. Like, damn, like some of us don't choose to have that privilege. You know, that privilege can come later on, but we're all born different. And for her just to say all these things in this chapter was kind of like, girl, you need to like, I don't know, talk to your editor or something. Cause this, I don't know how this was published. You know, this chapter was published. I feel like, I don't know. Thanks.
And, and not to drag it, but again, like if you're going to talk about drug dealers and you're talking about patriarchy and white supremacy, like, I mean, talk about that whole structure, not the little ass drug dealer, like, who can't, you know what I mean? Like, it's just bigger. It's just like bigger than that. But I mean, it's interesting with this book club because last week people were saying she was dragging it, and I was like, no. But then, but then this week, like, I really get it now. Like, I really understand where people are coming from. So that's just like my forgiveness. I'm sorry.
Maybe I'm reading it wrong. The young lady before, are you talking about page 110, where she says love is not a topic she thinks about, her life has been characterized by lack of love? Was that the area that?
There's several examples. I think, yeah, like the bottom of 110, and then we can start there.
It was 110, like that whole section of 110, just talking about that particular mom who she said, she writes that quote you just quoted, and also going into addicts who love is not a priority. Is kind of like, that's such a generalization where addiction and that kind of lifestyle is so much more complex than those generalizations.
Okay. No, because when I read that part, I agree with what you're saying, but I also think like she's commenting on the fact that she didn't have access to love. Like she didn't have the opportunity, the same opportunities that you're naming. And so this is the result. Like her behavior is a reaction to the lack of access, lack of love, lack of equity that she's experienced, where why should I be loving to a world or a society that has not shown me love? So I agree with like everything that you were saying, but I wanted to add that as another, like, maybe that's where she was coming from. I'm not sure.
And I think she talks about like the difference between, like, it seems like she's going more after sort of murder for luxury goods. Because on page 106, she says it's common for individuals to steal or attack someone in the interest of acquiring resources, money, food, or something as simple as a winter coat to ward off the cold. So like, that makes a little bit more sense, but in the sense of sort of the instant gratification that she's harping on in this, whether or not she does a good example of she does a good job of providing examples for that. I think that instant gratification is a real thing. I think it does really exist in our society for young folks and folks across the like spectrum and generations. I think that's something we do need to sit and kind of think about. And I think she does give capitalism its credit and the Protestant work ethic its credit for sparking that, that idea of instant gratification.
Yeah, I think the instant gratification is definitely coded in like respectability politics. I think I saw Tasha mention that earlier, that you came in right at respectability politics. And I don't know if y'all saw the first few weeks when we were talking, I linked a video of her talking about this book. And if y'all haven't watched it, y'all should really watch that, because you could totally see the respectability politics all over her analysis, all over her like point of view in terms of what she considers this text to do and how it should be functioning. And I think also not only is it respectability, there's a lot of pathologizing. And one other thing I was gonna say, there's also, it seems like she talks about forgiveness, and I think the thing with forgiveness is that you can't just practice forgiveness without having a process of repair. And I think that like, that's always a part that's missing. It's not just like, okay, I've forgiven you and now, that's it. There has to be some sort of repair. There has to be some sort of like steps that someone needs to take to actually just a like shift in how you're moving and how you're treating somebody. It's not just words, like they're actually like, what are some steps are you going to take to repair that relationship? If she's saying that in a consumerist culture, we throw people away. Okay, I'm gonna send that link again. Anybody else could comment in the meantime.
You know, something else we got to remember about Bell Hooks. She is an academic superstar, so she is bringing her academic privilege to everything she writes, and I'm sure she is writing honestly, but she's also writing to sort of benefit her academic place, which may be separate from the core tenets of what she's writing about. She's also trying to advance her place in the academy anytime she writes a book.
Funny you mention that, because I actually read this book in grad school, like in 2001, and I remember being kind of disappointed that like, oh, I guess this is like a regular book. This isn't an academic book, you know?
No, I'm not saying it's an academic book, but when she takes on a project, it's framed for the academy. Not so much that she's writing it as a text that would be used in the classroom, but as a text that might be used to her, for lack of a better word, matriculating through the academy.
But I mean, but even more so that like, one of the things that's really stuck out to me reading it again this time was, you know, it's back to what like lots of people have been saying, like how simplistic some of the analysis is. So like on page 107, when she's talking about like disillusionment after the Vietnam War and, you know, prior to the war, a hopeful vision of justice and love have been evoked by the civil rights struggle, the feminist movement and sexual liberation. But then, you know, there's that retrenchment that we all know that happened, but it's not like stuff just died, right? Like people kept fighting, people kept doing stuff. There were still active people, you know, when this book was actually being written. And I think one of the reasons why it's so hard for us to read this now is because we can see so much more progress has happened since then. And it's like, that's kind of what disappoints me. It's like, you're an academic, like what Bunny was saying, like add some statistics, add some citations, something to back up some really simple claims.
Right. And not for nothing, also we had to name that like throughout this, Bell Hooks is naming a sort of feminism throughout. And this, I guess, vein of feminism or like this, like, I don't know how to say genre of feminism because I feel like Bell Hooks is her own genre at this point. She has so much work, but is a feminism of its time in terms of like thinking about not only respectability politics, but also really invested in, I think, like speaking to white women as an audience, if that makes sense. Which goes, I think, with the academic sort of like point that Ron was bringing up, that if this is going to be the audience that she's writing for, which is ironic to me because if you listen to the video, she's specifically naming Black people and how she speaks. Now, in this text, we're assuming as a Black feminist that she's speaking to Black people, you would think, or she's talking about Black folks or people of color, specifically Black folks we're talking about. And when she talks in the video, she does say that. But in the text, it seems very condescending if that's exactly who she should be talking to. I don't know, which to me is a academic gesture of how things get written. It's like, well, I'm justifying my point because I just cited this 3 people before me, even though you don't know those 3 people I just cited them. So therefore I justified my point of view, which is how like feminist writing, essay writing is, you know, that's like how academia trains you to write.
I think, well, seeing the videos that we're now seeing about Toni Morrison and her saying that, you know, basically she would not pander to audiences outside of who she's actually speaking to. Yeah. And so with this in Bell Hooks, you can definitely tell like Toni would be like, "Ooh, girl, like this, we are the center," you know, and you can definitely see a lot of the pandering to, you know, she is writing to white people. I mean, I would say probably why, for me anyway, I resonated with like the first couple chapters that she was talking about. Like I literally will go back, and I've tried reading this before, like years ago, and I got to the first part and I was still like, oh my God, this is so good. But I never got to this second part. And that's okay. You know what I'm saying? Like, just listening to her speak and some of the other things that she's, you know, talking about now, and how she's like, you know, like I'm not playing, you know, these games, but I still appreciate her. So I'm not going to take that away from her.
Right.
But yeah, I just kind of felt like that's what was happening with this book. The love part was great. It was wonderful. I can see everybody embracing that part, but this part here, I don't think I don't think that was for us. That's not for the marginalized, you know. That I don't even think back then that was for us. But you know, if whoever it was that was saying about, you know, she was reaching for academia, then of course it makes sense. Even though I was still, even them, you know, I'm sure they would be like, where's your citations? You know, like, where did you come up with these numbers? And even the Black people were probably like, but there was also that discussion of about the drugs and you know, whatever the case may be. And I was just thinking, like, this probably would be that super predator talk. You know what I'm saying? Like, talking about the kids selling the drugs and buying this and buying that. That's, for some reason, like when I read that, I just kept thinking about Hillary Clinton. You know, super predators,
Oh my
how
God.
bad, you know, how bad these kids were, you know, and how terrible they are to do these things, you know. But yeah, that's what I thought about.
So in closing out, like the chapter on love ethic, I don't know if anyone felt sort of put off, like I felt put off by when she mentions on page 100 in the last paragraph, I like living in small towns precisely because there are most often the places in our nation where basic principles underlying a love ethic exist and are the standards by which most people try to live their lives. And then she goes on to say that, well, she lives in a small town, part-time, and then she spends some of her time in New York, but even though I'm in a co-op building, you know, to me, I don't know if anyone felt this way. I just felt it was just kind of, well, even though I spend time in New York, you know, it's in a, you know, in a co-op building, but I felt, or I interpreted, like outside of New York, outside of this co-op building situation, not really much neighborly and community loving people in New York. Could be a reach. I'm not sure. I personally felt put off by it.
Yeah, in this whole small town, there's a better love ethic is not true at all. But yeah, that was definitely a reach. And like, yeah, reading this the second time over, I see like how it's entrenched in the respectability politics thing. So yeah.
Yep, sounds like Make America Great Again.
But I think
I think it speaks to also kind of trying to, again, make it simplistic. And I think it's easy when, if you're living in a small town and you have more or less a monolithic place and everybody knows everyone's name and it's like Cheers or whatever, and you say, yeah, great, everyone's lovey-dovey and can forgive and blah, 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 blah. But when you are in a complex place like New York City, where there's all this diversity, where there is a lot going on, and there are people saying, you know what, this is wrong, what you did, or they're pointing out injustices and constantly fighting the powers that be, then, you know, it begs, you know, the question of why aren't you actually exploring that complexity? And showing where the love is in those complex environments that, you know, the majority of people in the United States are living in. The majority of people live in cities in this country. And so we need to talk about where the majority of people live and how they are finding love. And I think, you know, by kind of going back to a simplistic place of like, okay, you know, that's why I like my hometown, small towns, then it's kind of excusing her out of like actually having to explore the more complex ways of finding love in areas that are complex.
I agree. And even with the country thing, we also have to realize too, like we're thinking about the economy or what have you in those small country towns. The divide between the rich and the poor is even larger, you know. So who is she talking about, and what area does she live in this country town that she's staying in? Because you know, it's easy. Like even me and my friends joke. I'm from Arkansas, so even me and my friends and I, we joke like, oh man, whenever we make it big and we make our money, we're gonna go home and we're gonna buy up a whole bunch of houses. You know what I'm saying? Like, I mean, and so for me, I'm just thinking like, okay, when you make this big time money and you go to these small country towns, you get to still also divide yourself. You get to live out on that huge plot of land. I'm thinking about Oprah and her collard greens like the size of boulders. I'm sorry. But anyway, but you get to do that. You get to talk about the good time living when you're going to the country club in your town, and they let you in because they know you can afford to, rub elbows with, the mayor and all these other different things. How do those other people on the other side of the tracks feel, about that great small town living,
I found that whole section really ironic too, because the beginning of the last paragraph, so in 101, she talks about the principles of the love ethic again, showing care, respect, knowledge, integrity, and the will to cooperate. Like, what other place takes 8 million people and says, we're all going to figure out how to get to work and get home in a reasonable manner, right? Than a place like New York City. Like, this is the only place where I see more of these principles actually put in practice. Like, living in small spaces teaches you how to treat people with respect and with care. And only in New York City is the only place where I see $1 falls out of someone's pocket and 5 people are pointing, going, you lost $1, you lost $1.
Right.
I never see that anywhere else, right?
Yeah, the Bronx also has a majority of worker-owned cooperatives in the country, and they're owned by all women of color. Majority of worker-owned cooperatives are owned by women of color, and the Bronx has the most of them. Majority of them.
What city is Bell Hooks from? Where is she from?
Kentucky.
No, sir.
Okay.
Where?
Kentucky, somebody said?
Okay.
But she said all her and her New York her and her New York neighbors, they all get along wonderfully. So I can only imagine who her neighbors are.
She was, according to the Google site, she was born in Hopkinsville, Kentucky.
Okay.
Got it. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So one of the things I thought was a little bit naive too, I would say, or you can tell that Bell Hooks isn't a community organizer at all, is page 98. If all public policy was created in the spirit of love, we would not have to worry about unemployment, homelessness, school failing to teach children, or addiction. All right. Like, now, I guess, first of all, I feel like a statement like that is it could be seen as dangerous because it really oversimplifies how legislation and policy actually work on a municipal level, on a very hyper-local level, depending on who you're talking to, because public policy can look very different depending on the kind of city structure that we have. We're talking about what she's essentially, like, I guess, talking about or trying to critique is urban planning, and I guess like how cities get developed which is really, I guess, at the core of what she's trying to speak to here, is if like the policies in which cities are made of have love in them, these things wouldn't happen. Not only is that like radically different for like a city like New York City versus like a city like, you know, a smaller rural city, you know, it's a lot to place on not only the structure itself. And I'm curious as to why she really took public policy serious in a textbook that basically questions the foundations of the United States, which is, you know, her critique around the lack of love that is part of the American culture. For that, I think a more creative phrase or a more creative response would have been like to create another system completely based on love, or one can gesture to like worker-owned cooperatives or like community land trusts that is in our history, specifically with Black farmers in the South, how created systems of interconnectivity and interdependence through community land trusts, I think is an act of love. Like that's a loving ethic, you know, a way to think cooperatively and collectively. I think that this particular page like was too much. I was like, that's not how that works. You know, it's just not like, just logistically, like that's not how like things work per se. Like if we wanted to pass a new legislation, like it requires not only a love ethic, but it's not the public policy that needs to be created with love, is like the organizing, the community that comes together to like ask and advocate for that. That's part of the love. And with that, I guess you can feel that, but within the way that change happens, at least in our city, is in community boards. So it's like if community boards are formed with love, will we see changes? Will we see different kinds of policy that won't rezone our neighborhoods, that won't gentrify our neighborhoods, if it was done with love and not greed, you know?
Did anybody have a favorite chapter?
Hi.
My favorite chapter was chapter 5. Oh, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good chapter 5.
What did you like about chapter 5?
The whole thing. The whole thing. I didn't get past chapter 6, but up until then, I liked everything about the book. Page 76. I was highlighting and everything. Like, oh my God, this is good. Yeah. And it just it made me think about forgiveness with yourself. Like I wasn't thinking about community forgiveness. I was thinking about self-forgiveness. Like when you forgive somebody, it makes you bigger. Like it makes your love expand more. That's how I was seeing it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think in chapter 5, her is about love and spirituality, and like I think the ones before that was about self-love too. So I think it was falling in line with that. So I could see that.
I actually appreciated chapter 8.
Yeah, it was.
I like her definition of community. And I appreciated that there's even a chapter here that has some emphasis on community and communal living. It feels like it's something that folks are starting to talk about a lot more now in this particular moment where we really do need each other. So I appreciated the inclusion of that here, and how like she tells us again, like you can't really do this alone. You can't even do this in couples. This requires community to grow and like really learn how to love.
Yeah, I do agree. In chapter 8, she does a good job of like explaining making and building community. And when I first read that, it was really important to me because I moved to New York City and I started graduate school and didn't know anyone. So like it really helped me put in perspective of like the types of relationships that would be beneficial to me, especially like in terms of like people who don't have a great traditional family structure, like her emphasizing the importance that they build not only like intimate partnerships, but as well as platonic partnerships and valuing your friendships, and not just reserving a particular type of love for romantic partnerships. So I did like how she explained that in chapter 8.
Yep, I think my favorite chapter from her was chapter 4 about commitment. For me, commitment to myself has been a struggle, if such thing is possible. I mean, you know, like I kind of have an issue with like being able to sit down and make goals for myself. I've kind of been a fly by the seat kind of person, you know, like I get up, I go to work, I do XYZ. Most of my things aren't planned, you know, and if they are planned, I'm actually surprised at myself that I committed to that, you know. Back to chapter 4, and I know that's a while back. Just some of the things that I wrote in the margin. I'm answering when someone asked, what were your favorite? What did you like about the book? Just because, you know, like I said, the first part was just like, it was mind blowing, and it's still mind blowing. She was giving us like the list of things that you need to do, you know, and I said, in order to love myself, I need to do the following, and also love myself and others. I trust myself. I know myself. I am committed to myself. I care for myself. I respect myself, and I'm responsible for myself, you know. And so those are things that, like, you know, those things need to be written down. Everywhere I go, I need to be able to see that, to commit to those things. So I really appreciate chapter 4. And I will say that even with like all the, I don't know if it's contradictions or as someone said, oversimplifying, but I'm just grateful for the fact that, like, you know, I don't have to be an academic to see that some of these things have changed. You know, we have seen so much progress since then. I mean, now even the kids these days know what intersectionality is. They know what, you know, you don't have to be an academic. You don't have to, you know, have a master's or a PhD to understand, you know, that we are walking, you know, everything about us is politics, you know, what we eat, where we sleep, you know, all of these different things. And just to see the growth in our communities, to know that some of this stuff is outdated. You know what I'm saying? We could have easily floated through this, just like there are plenty of people that are floating through, what is it? Women are from Venus, men are from Mars, you know, and keeping that same simple rhetoric. And now we know better. So I'm grateful that, like, we can go back and read this now and be like, okay, we'll take it for what it's worth, but, you know, Mama Bell, you need some critiquing too, and that's okay.
I was actually looking at the same part that everyone else was looking at on page 115, when she says at the bottom, when greedy consumption is the order of the day, dehumanization becomes acceptable. And I felt like she kind of went a little bit left after she made that statement, you know, just talking about like young people and stuff like that. And I felt like she kind of dropped the ball, because I'm thinking about this pandemic and what does that mean. And I think where she dropped the ball, I was just listening to a conversation with Kimberly Crenshaw and T.S.A. Lehman and Arundhati Roy and another author, talking about the politics of humiliation. In particular, that's T.S.A. Lehman's term, like, for it, is like the politics of humiliation, and just the fact that once you start to think of capitalism in this way, you start to see people as very much disposable, right? And not just like in like, oh, if you don't do what I want you to do, but just to like maintain order. Like, who are we asking to go out and go back to work? Who are we asking to wear these masks? Who are we asking to, you know, so like that really came up for me just in that topic sentence statement. I felt like she kind of deviated from the larger structure at that point of what I like, maybe what I was thinking. But I felt like where she kind of dropped the ball, I think T.S.A. Lehman gave like more language to, and was just like, there are certain Black and brown people, and he specifically says Black women, being that he's from the South, he's from Mississippi. He was like, you know, I'm seeing Black women as being the ones who are being like caught up in this, you know, greed consumption. You know what I mean? Like the fact that white folks are running around here without masks, running around here being served, who are serving them, then have to be masked, then have to be caring of their safety, but not the other way around, says a lot. You know what I mean? So I wish there would have been a little bit more talk about like who really gets caught up in that statement of like who's dehumanized, right? Like, and I know she's talking generally, but in this particular moment, like that's what I'm thinking about, like who is disposable, who is being caught up in the greed, and that. So I just took what I wanted and I discarded the rest out of that paragraph. You know, I mean, I took what I needed and I left it there.
So when I just read, I didn't get this far. When I read this part, it made me think about like how the videos are. You know how you see a video and the girl's like shaking her butt or whatever, and then you know the people behind it is not the people that's rapping. You know what I mean? Like it's not. That's what I was thinking about with greed. When greed comes is order of the day, dehumanized. So it's like they're being dehumanized. Some would see it that way, like a girl shaking her butt up there, half naked, and behind the rap, it's not the people that's rapping it. You understand? You kind of understand what I'm saying? That's how I see it when I just read that part. Like, oh, dehumanized. Somebody would see it that way, like she dehumanized herself up there.
Yeah,
Whoever's
and along,
pushing that video out, younger girls.
along gender lines, it's usually a male rapper with women dancers.
Right.
So it's kind of the same thing.
There's this part in page 119 where she kind of comments that with a concrete example in her experience interviews Little Kim. Where she says she has no interest in love, where she's all about money. And you guys know, I don't know if you guys know about Little Kim, but she hypersexualizes herself and uses her sexuality as a trope for her music, for her look, for everything. But she's a brand. Little Kim is a brand. That's not who she is completely. And to kind of like judge as, I don't know, I felt that was kind of judgmental how she was describing Little Kim. Whereas, like, yeah, Lil' Kim is from Brooklyn. She went through what she went through. But she got her bag. Like, she got her... Oh, it's page 119, honey. In the section of greed. It's in the chapter of greed. I'm just answering Stephanie. Stephanie answered, yeah. But, I don't know. I felt like... I don't know if you all got to that part or if you read that section, but I don't know. She's kind of judgmental in a way. The tone is judgmental. I don't know if she's being judgmental. It means to be that way. But that was an example of like what I'm sorry, who said who talked to me, but who talked before, but no, I feel like if you're a brand and that's what you're about and you're doing things and you want to live your life, just live your life. You know, you can feel however you want about women making money or people coming up from Brooklyn from a disadvantaged place and being famous, you know. I don't know. That's just how I feel about it.
No, I get that. And actually, I also felt that way. I felt like Belle didn't show her much grace. You know what I'm saying? And of course, now, you know, we can go back in the archives and like, and read about some of the interviews that Little Kim has had over the decades, saying that, and you have to think about like who all was around her at that time. You know what I'm saying? You had Mary J. Blige, which Mary isn't, you know, she's not dark skin. I call her, she's not fair either. She's somewhere in the middle. But you had Puffy's baby mama, you know what I'm saying, the light skinned lady. You had Faith Evans. You had all of these women who looked nothing like Little Kim. Little Kim, she was guttural because that was the only way that she could get attention. You know what I'm saying? And even she carried that with her for so long. And I just thought, like, Belle, that could have been your moment to like really come through for your sister. All this talk about feminist talk and like how, you know, we've never had the fair advantage. Why couldn't that have been applied to Little Kim at that time, as opposed to saying all these things about her? She doesn't have no love and she's about, you know, whatever. Yeah, Lil' Kim can get the bag, but we also see what she did with that bag. You know what I'm saying? That bag did not provide love for her, but I can also say too that like Belle didn't really show her any love either. Like, why would you make a whole like couple paragraphs talking about her like that when you had like
sorry.
May I speak on?
No.
I'm sorry. So yeah, Lil Kim, Faith Evans, Puffy, that whole genre of people, that was pretty much my period of hip hop. So I know all of those artists. Bell Hooks was huge during that time as well, because you had Bell Hooks presenting the antithesis of this strong sexuality from Black women, where her theory back then was that these women were setting, well, Little Kim and the likes of her were setting Black women back. And this was something that was heavily discussed amongst Black feminism discussions. However, we don't know who, yes, the question is, who are behind these people, right? Who is Jay-Z's rapper who's not as big as Little Kim, but Jay-Z had like someone who was like Little Kim?
Foxy Brown.
Foxy Brown,
Foxy
right.
Brown.
So it was the same dynamic as well. And we don't know who were behind these women. And the criticism, I was hesitant to read Bell Hooks' books because she was also very critical of Beyonce for the same exact reason, even though Beyonce is a mega powerhouse in comparison to the likes of Lil Kim and Foxy Brown. But Bell Hooks was critical of these women using their sexuality to capitalize and using their sexuality as their brand. But at the same time, do we know who has chosen, who made those choices? These women make these choices, decide to use their sexuality and put themselves out there, or were they forced to do it by men behind them? So, there's that question where I would have appreciated Bell Hooks to delve into, to pose that question out there for us to think about, as opposed to completely setting back sisters who are making bank for doing something that they knew would be profitable. I'm not supporting what they're doing, nor am I going against what they're doing. If anything, I'm criticizing Bell Hooks's approach towards these Black women who were presenting themselves in a way that they felt they could capitalize on, and, as what was stated earlier, leave a brand and also leave a legacy. Because homegirl, my girl from the Bronx, wouldn't be who she is if it wasn't for Lil Kim.
Cardi B.
Cardi B, right. There wouldn't be a Cardi B if it
Yeah.
weren't for Lil Kim. And everyone loves Cardi B. Everyone loves Cardi B. But she wouldn't be Cardi B. Cardi B wouldn't be who she is if it weren't for Lil Kim, point blank. That's not even an argument. So let's talk about, why can't Bell Hooks pose this question? Who exactly, what is driving these women to make these decisions, as opposed to being critical of the decisions these women are making?
I feel like I think that's a really good, strong critique, right? That like, it's based in patriarchy, right? Like the types of personas that are available in a certain genre of music in a certain period of time meant women got two options, right? And it still divides up in a very like virgin whore kind of way, right? I feel like you can also go another way, which is the idea that you have to have a personal brand, right? Like capitalism has gotten to the point where like you have to reduce your humanity into a certain spectrum and sell it, is also problematic from a greed perspective. Like, and I think one of the problems I had in this chapter is that the analysis is just so superficial, and there's so many other ways you could get down deeper. Instead, it just seems like these like random attacks on anonymous mother of a drug dealer or Lil Kim or whomever.
I also want to point out that, there's different ways of feminism, and and Bell Hooks subscribed to, I forget what wave, but I think it was like the second wave of feminism, which is why she quotes a lot of the white feminists, because at that time, or the wave that she subscribes to is very much rooted in a certain type of politic. And it does, from our perspective, and I think from today's perspective, and I think we've only just named this as respectability politics, right? But there was a certain way that wave of feminism felt like women should be, how they should act, you know, how they should be viewed in society. There was a lot of dismissal of certain types of women, and if you were woman, then you were not a feminist. And so I think that we, you know, bell hooks is old school, if we want to put it that way, right? And I think we kind of put it in that context. You know, I critique bell hooks as much as the next person, but you know, she has written some transformative works despite that. And I so appreciate this book despite some of the things that she does not dig into. But there are like modern day feminists who absolutely dig into these issues, that we can certainly like read after that. And like, you know, and also I think she overreached and maybe shouldn't have even talked about some of the issues that, you know, were above her purview at the time. Like, why even broach some of these issues when you know you can't go as deep into them as they probably need to be probed into? So, you know, I'm wondering why she, you know, if she was, you know, pressured by the editor to just mention this, you know, like there's other things, there's other factors working here as well. But I do again want to place her in the time and in the generation that she's coming from as well.
I wonder, it feels a little bit like there's a fine line between like respectability politics and giving these women agency and saying they made these decisions to do whatever they needed to do. It's not a criticism of them. It's just like Little Kim made decisions and that's okay. I think we can say that she made a decision to be who she wanted to be and that's fine. Like, does that have to be respectability politics? Or like, I think there's like this line that it feels like we keep going back and forth. And I'm wondering which is which.
I mean, she never states anything about Little Kim's talent or anything. And that's a huge problem with me. I think she makes more so of a morality judgment on her. And that for me lends it to the area of respectability politics, because you don't describe her talent that has allowed her to amass these different things. Like, she's not out here like being the world's Kim Kardashian. Like, she has a talent that she was able to use in order to generate this lifestyle for herself. And I think if you're going to be true to feminism, like, you have to like give her credit for that.
I mean, I don't think she's not. She says at some point, like, I found it fascinating that she had no interest in love. Like, it seems that was out of Lil' Kim's mouth. It doesn't seem like that was a judgment she was making. And that's true, fine. Like, that's not a critique. It's just like, that's what Lil' Kim was. Like, I imagine that if somebody's saying this, she's just taking it as her word and saying like, oh, that's interesting. Like, you don't want to talk about love, but you'd rather talk about sort of this material thing. Like, what does that mean? And you're right, she doesn't, like everybody's saying, she doesn't give enough like analysis to that. Like, she could have thought about that herself and went there, and she doesn't. And that's where I think the problem is. But to say that like this person said, I have no interest in love, that might be a true statement. And that's something that like we can all look at, I think, without like saying that, oh, this is respectability.
Got it. Any last comments? It's 8:30 and we technically are closing our conversation at this time. Any last comments? Okay, cool. Thank you so much, everyone, for such a great discussion. Next week, we'll be meeting again at the same time, 7 p.m. Make sure to register ahead of time so you get the password. And before we close our conversation, I just want to thank everyone who shared names of those who are no longer with us. Thank you so much for all the names that were said aloud and all those that are in our hearts.